Dr. Carson, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Carson, you are Director of Paediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, but your life started as a poor boy growing up in the neighbourhoods of Detroit. Tell us about that remarkable journey.
Well, you know, my parents got divorced when I was very young. My mother was one of 24 children, got married when she was 13, only had a third-grade education, discovered that my father was a bigamist, had another family. And so the divorce ensued, and there she was with no education, no money, and responsibility of taking care of two young kids. And she didn't want to be on welfare, so she worked 2 and 3 jobs at a time, cleaning people's houses. I was a horrendous student. I didn't think that I was smart. My classmates agreed my nickname was Dummy. That's what everybody called me. But, you know, my mother was always praying and asking God, help her figure out a way that she could get her sons to have a better life than she did. And came up with this ideal of making us read books. Turn off the TV. We could only watch 2 or 3 TV programs, and with all that spare time, we had to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Library, submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. She put little check marks and highlights and stuff. And I hated it because everybody else was outside playing and having fun. There I was in the house reading books. In the beginning, I hated it, but after a while, I actually began to enjoy it because we were desperately poor, no money for anything. But the books were free from the library. And between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. My horizons began to expand dramatically, particularly as I began to read stories about people of great accomplishment. And I began to understand that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's not the environment. And that was very empowering. And, you know, I got to the point where if I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. Instead of calling me dummy, pretty soon people were calling me bookworm. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And, you know, you would have thought that maybe everything was going to be great after that, but I also had a horrible temper. And that would get me in trouble a lot. And one day when I was 14, I tried to stab another youngster. And fortunately, he had on a large metal belt buckle under his clothing, and a knife blade struck it with such force that it broke. And he fled in terror, but I was more terrified because I recognized I was trying to kill somebody over nothing. And I locked myself in the bathroom and just started contemplating my life and recognizing that I would never realize my dream of becoming a physician with that kind of temper. And I just prayed for the Lord to somehow help me. And there was a Bible there, and I picked it up and opened to the book of Proverbs, and there were all these verses in there about anger and all the trouble it gets you into. Like Proverbs 19:19 that says there's no point in getting an angry man out of trouble. He's just going to get right back in it. But encouraging verses like Proverbs 16:32, mightier is the man who can control his temper than the man who can conquer a city. And as I stayed there contemplating, reading, and praying, it dawned on me that to react, to punch somebody, to kick down a door was not a sign of strength, but rather it was a sign of weakness. It meant that you could easily be controlled by the environment and by other people. And I said, that's not what I want to do. And you know, I learned to start looking at things from other people's point of view, step outside the circle, because if you're not the center of the circle, then everything's not pointing at you. And, you know, really people who are angry all the time, if they really stop and think about it, it's because they're selfish. It's because everything is about them. Somebody took my thing, somebody's in my space, they did this to me, you know. Forget about that. When you learn how to step outside of that, almost no one can make you angry. And, you know, that once the temper was under control, the academics were under control, you know, it was just zoom to the finish line.
I mean, statistically, though, a very different result for you than from a lot of the other boys that grew up in the same neighborhood as you, in some ways with similar opportunities. What made you different?
I think the key thing that made me different is that I trusted in God. You know, when I was doing all that reading, I was reading things like the Bible too, and I read the story of Joseph and how he was sold into slavery by his own brothers. And he didn't say, bummer, my own brother sold me into slavery and become a victim. He said, if I'm going to be a slave, I'll be the best slave there is. And he became the head of Potiphar's household, the captain of the Egyptian guard. And then he gets thrown into jail because Potiphar's wife tells a lie on him because he won't sleep with her. And, you know, he doesn't say, bummer. You know, I'm trying to live up to my values and principles and I end up in jail. No, he says, I'll be the best prisoner there is, gets a responsible position in the jail, starts interpreting dreams, interprets Pharaoh's dreams, becomes a governor of Egypt. And those kinds of things really had an effect on me. And, you know, I read a book called Up From Slavery about Booker T. Washington, born a slave, illegal for slaves to read. He taught himself to read, read everything in sight, became an advisor to 2 presidents. And all those things began to tell me that, you know, it doesn't really matter what everybody else is doing. You know, everything exists that you need in order to do anything you want to do. For the first time, you know, I could see in my classmates' eyes a look of admiration instead of a look of disdain for this stupid kid. And within a year and a half, I'd gone from the bottom of the class to the top of the class.
You have a reputation, particularly as a young surgeon, of taking on challenges. What drove you to be that person that took those opportunities?
Well, you know, maybe I was just young and foolish, I don't know, but to a certain extent, you know, when you deal with something like the Bender, you know, conjoined twins from Germany, joined at the back of the head, of course, that had never been done before successfully and have them both survive, nor has it since that time, by the way. But I had become interested in the whole concept of separating twins a couple of months before I knew anything about them, and started trying to figure out why the results were so dismal, and concluded that it was primarily exsanguination or bleeding to death. And then I started thinking, well, what could you do to keep them from bleeding to death? And I was talking to a friend who was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Hopkins, and he had done a lot of work with hypothermic arrest, where you cool the body temperature, pump all the blood out, the heart stops, and you can operate on the baby's heart for up to an hour before you have to pump the blood back in and warm it up and start the heart up. And I was thinking, if we got to the critical part of a separation where we have to cut through the large vessels, but there was no blood flowing through them, and then we could get them reconstructed and then put the blood back in. And I said, wow, that would really be cool. And then I said, why am I thinking about that? I'm never going to see a set of them. And lo and behold, 2 months later, here they appeared. And, you know, and when I explained this plan to everybody, they said, wow, that sounds like it might work. And, you know, I personally believe that God inspired me to be prepared at that time. And I've found that time and time again. And after a while, I came to understand that perhaps this was in order to give me a platform. And you use that platform to affect many more lives than you can in the operating room.
I mean, that was one of the well-known successes, but also, of course, there have been surgeries that have been unsuccessful.
Yes.
How do you process that, particularly as a Christian?
I recognize that I'm not in control. I have one responsibility, and that is to do the best that I can do. So I always say you do your best and you let God do the rest. And sometimes what we may think should be the outcome is not what the outcome should be. And we just have to take that by faith and move on to the next circumstance. Fortunately, you know, the bad outcomes are few and far between, but I process them. And there have been some that I thought were going to be really bad outcomes. I remember once a young woman who had this horrendous brain tumor, and then she began to bleed and her brain began to herniate, and we had to stuff it back into her cranium and close it up, and she was brain dead and for 3 days, and finally they said, we got to turn everything off. And I prayed so hard that night because she was like the center of this mother's life. And we went in to turn off the respirator that morning, and she moved her finger. And that was the beginning of a recovery for that little girl. And that mother, who had been an atheist, years later, I was doing a book signing, and she came up to me and she said, do you know who I am? And I said, you look familiar. And then she explained, and she says, you know, I am now a Christian.
Wow. Still got a lot that I'd love to talk about, but we'll take a quick break now and be back in just a moment.
Hey, Kizzy, how are you, young lady? You look wonderful. How old are you now? 8. 8?
Do you remember when you did the operation with me?
Now, how could I forget that? I always pray before every single surgery that I do because God created the body. He knows the most about it. And I asked him to give me wisdom. And, you know, so far he's been very generous with dealing out his wisdom. And I like to mention the fact that I think he has a sense of humor because my middle name is Solomon, which of course was the wisest man who ever lived. He knew that I was going to be always asking him for wisdom. But I also start every day and end every day reading from the book of Proverbs, which was written by Solomon. And he knew that was going to happen. But also when Solomon became the king of Israel, as you may or may not remember, the first thing that made him very famous, 2 women came to him claiming to be the mother of the same baby. And what did he do? He advocated dividing the babies. Well, that's when I became very well known, dividing babies also. So God has a sense of humor. He really does.
Not only a very talented neurosurgeon, but also an author, a speaker. You find time in your busy schedule to travel here to New Zealand, which we're very pleased about. How do you balance, how do you prioritise and decide of the many things that you could do, what's the important ones to say yes to and what to say no to?
Well, first of all, I always say if you need somebody to do something, you have to get somebody who's busy. Because people who are not busy never have time to do anything because it takes them all day to do nothing. Having said that, you know, I pray, I ask God to give me wisdom. And, you know, I also have a tendency to like to write things down. Write down what you need to do, all the things that need to be done over this course of time, and review that list and prioritize it and say, on this particular day, what has to be done? During this particular week, what has to be done? What would be nice to do? And you know, if you categorize it that way, you're much less likely to spin your wheels. But see, most people will not do that. And most people do not organize. Most people tend to react. They go through life reacting rather than planning. And one of the reasons I think that God gave us these incredibly sophisticated brains, which were made in his image, by the way, is so that we could plan a day in advance, a week in advance, a year in advance, 5 years, 10 years, and actually have a way of bringing things together and making them work.
Being a person of influence and also being a role model to the next generation of young people, perhaps growing up in similar circumstances to which you grew up, and this is very much a passion of yours as well with the Carson scholarships and with literacy programs. Tell us about that aspect of what you do.
Well, you know, I recognize that, you know, the circumstances under which I was raised, most people don't succeed. And they may have every bit as much intellect as I do, but they just don't have the vision. So what we've tried to do is provide a way that they can get that vision. The Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. What they need to do is they need to see somebody who is in a circumstance similar to theirs and see what the road was to get out of there. And unfortunately, in our society today, certainly in America, and I'm sure it's probably to some degree like that in New Zealand too, you know, there's so much emphasis on sports, and entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous, and really stuff that doesn't amount to a hill of beans and really doesn't have a whole lot of relevance for the vast majority of people, except that it realistically causes them to pursue things that aren't very likely to pan out for them. And the things that are likely to pan out, such as developing your intellect and planning your course, and nobody really talks about that. So consequently, the society becomes, I hate to say it, dumber and dumber. You go out on the street and you take your average person and you query them about world history. They don't know anything. You query them about national history. They don't know anything. Current events, well, maybe they know a little bit about the Kardashians or something. But, you know, it's just, it's absurd.
But instead of saying, oh, well, you know, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, you're the guy that said, yes, but actually,
This
I
is
want to
what-
be the guy to do something about it.
Right, this is what you can do. So, you know, we started putting in reading rooms in schools and in libraries and other public places. And these places are decorated with a lot of imagination, with different themes, beanbag chairs, very comfortable place. Little kids love to be in them. And they get points for the number of books they read, the amount of time they spend in them. And they can trade those in for prizes. And in the beginning, they do it for the prizes, but it doesn't take long before that translates into much better academic performance and interest now in what's going on in school. Those are not kids who are likely to drop out of school. Those are kids who are likely to go on and be performers. We also, with our scholarship program, we select students who've achieved at the highest academic levels and who also demonstrate humanitarian qualities. We don't want people who are just smart. But we need people who are smart who also care about other individuals. And we try to put them on the same kind of pedestal as the all-state, you know, basketball player or football player. And it's making a very big difference. We have the program going in all 50 states now. And, you know, it's so essential because we really have to get the next generation thinking beyond, you know, the silliness, quite frankly. And I don't have anything against sports entertainment, don't get me wrong, but you know, when you idolize it and when you put it on such a pedestal that the important things get neglected, then I think you've made a little bit of a mistake. And it's the same thing that every great society has done before their fall. Ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, Great Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, they all do the same thing and they all go down the tubes.
Well, fortunately, there's a generation growing up in America and in many places around the world that say, I want to be like Dr. Carson when I grow up.
Well, this is what we're hoping. And that was the theme of our new book that just came out, America the Beautiful, to try to wake people up before we go off the cliff and learn a little bit. And I think this has general applicability to all societies, you know.
Dr. Carson, of all of the things that you've done, of all of the achievements that you've had in your life so far, what would you like your legacy to be? What would you like to be remembered for?
I would like to be remembered as the person who got people to think big. And, you know, each one of those letters means something special. The T for talent, the H for honesty, the I for insight, the N for nice, the K for knowledge, B for books, I for in-depth learning, and G for God. You know, and we live in a society now where God has become politically incorrect. And, you know, he's had such an important influence in my life. And, you know, people can neglect him if they want, but, you know, they are really missing out on a tremendous help to developing their potential.
Dr. Carson, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. The majority of success comes from wisdom, comes from knowing when to do something, how to do something, when not to do something, being able to distinguish between what you can do and what you cannot do. Technical skills, the knowledge, those are things that can be acquired, but I believe wisdom comes from God, and it has to be sought and asked for.